Congressman Goodlatte, welcome to our Constitutional Chats podcast.
Well, Kathy, thank you very much. It's an honor to be with all of you, with Tova and Jorn and Jewel. And I look forward to getting some questions from all of you, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to take some from our viewers as well if they type them in to the chat. So I'll start out by simply saying a little bit more about my experience in the Congress and my background. I grew up in Massachusetts and went to college in Maine, as Kathy mentioned, and moved to Virginia to attend law school at Washington and Lee. I've always been involved in politics. At Bates College, I was the president of the College Republicans. And when I graduated from law school, I went to work for a former congressman from here in Virginia named Caldwell Butler. He was well known for serving on the House Judiciary Committee, as did his predecessor, another Virginia congressman who represented the 6th Congressional District, named Dick Poff. And so when I got into the Congress and was asked what committees I wanted to serve on, the Judiciary Committee was a high priority for me, and I was able to do that. So there's been a long history of members of Congress from the 6th Congressional District who have served on that committee. But after I worked with Caldwell Butler, who, by the way, the other thing he's really well known for is that he was on the Judiciary Committee when Richard Nixon was impeached by well, actually, he wasn't impeached. The House Judiciary Committee voted out articles of impeachment against him. He resigned before those articles were brought to the full floor of the House of Representatives for impeachment purposes. And so therefore there was no trial in the United States Senate. But that's all covered in the Constitution as well, how that entire process worked. And he was a remarkable individual and a great inspiration to me. So after I completed my work for him, I stayed involved as a party chairman, Roanoke City chairman, and then the 6th Congressional District chairman of the Republican Party here in Virginia. And then in 1992, when my predecessor, a Democrat by the name of Jim Olin, announced his retirement, I ran for Congress myself, and it was the first time I'd run for public office, and was not an entirely new experience since I'd worked on so many other campaigns. But when you're the candidate yourself, it is a remarkably different experience. I got elected and then was chosen by the Republican conference. Each party gets to, in the US Congress, each party gets to pick the members that they want to serve on each committee. It's different at the state level. For example, here in Virginia, the Speaker of the House, whether he or she is a Republican or a Democrat, they pick all the members of all the committees of both parties. But in any event, I was selected to serve on the Judiciary Committee and the Agriculture Committee. And I had the honor of serving as chairman of the Agriculture Committee earlier on in my time in the Congress. And then my last 6 years in Congress, I served as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, which has a very, very wide array of issues that it deals with. I'll just describe the 5 subcommittees that it has, and that'll give you a good idea. One is called the courts, the internet, and intellectual property. So patents, copyrights, trademarks, trade names, trade secrets, the entire federal court system, not the appointment of judges, but it's involved with the removal of judges. In fact, I actually tried a case on the floor of the Senate to remove a federal judge who had been engaged in a number of misdeeds. In addition to that, there's the Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security Subcommittee. It deals with all federal criminal laws, of which there are hundreds and hundreds of them, as well as issues related to our nation's security, including issues related to terrorist attacks. And the Fourth Amendment, you mentioned the Project for Privacy and Surveillance Accountability, one of the groups that I'm a policy advisor for. That group deals with the issue of the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which protects all of us against unreasonable searches and seizures. And so there are lots of laws related to when the government can gather information about you and when they can't, And are those laws constitutional? It's a very rapidly evolving area, and I do a lot of work in that area, and that would also stem from that particular subcommittee. Then there's the subcommittee on the Constitution itself and all constitutional amendments that are offered to the United States Constitution originate in the Judiciary Committee in the House of Representatives. They're very difficult to pass. We haven't adopted a new constitutional amendment in now close to 30 years. None were adopted during the time that I served in the Congress, except for one that had been adopted 200 years before, but had not been ratified by a sufficient number of states. 3/4 of the states have to ratify a constitutional amendment. And lo and behold, this constitutional amendment had been sitting there for a long time. There was nothing attached to it that said it expired after a period of time. So it was finally ratified by enough states and it became law about 30 years ago. So it's very difficult to pass them, but that doesn't stop people from trying, including me. I offered an amendment to the Constitution to balance the budget many, many times during my tenure in Congress, and came very, very close to passing on at least one of those occasions. Had it been passed, I think it would have been a great thing to provide the kind of fiscal discipline that the federal government needs to have, that state and local governments have, that families and businesses, large and small, they all have to live within a balanced budget. They don't balance their budget year after year after year like the Congress hasn't done. They go into bankruptcy. So it concerns me greatly that that's an issue that needs to be addressed by the Congress in the future. But right now, it is not anywhere near the top of their priorities, and that's, in my opinion, a shame. In addition to that, there's the antitrust and regulatory subcommittee. It deals with all of our antitrust laws. And while the Judiciary Committee doesn't cover all of the different agencies of the government that write regulations, we write the rules for all of those agencies on how they can adopt regulations and all the things they have to go through to have openness, to have public input, and so on before a regulation can be adopted. And then finally, immigration and border security, another major area and a very hot topic right now. I happen to have been an immigration lawyer before I became a member of Congress. So I'm a believer in two things. One, we are a nation of immigrants. There's hardly anybody watching this program who couldn't go back a few generations or several generations and find someone in their family who immigrated to the United States. But I'm also a believer in the rule of law, and that we have to have respect for that. So if you want to immigrate to the United States, you need to follow a legal process to accomplish that. And those are the areas of work of the Judiciary Committee. Now, Article 1 of the Constitution sets forth all of the powers that the Congress operates under, but it has expanded well beyond the several pages that are included in Article 1. So the first issue is, why is the Congress covered in Article 1, the very first article of the Constitution? And the answer is that we were, as a new country, we had struggled with a previous form of government called the Articles of Confederation. And they weren't working because the states had too much power and they didn't have to cooperate with each other. And so there wasn't enough power at the federal government. Now, people might laugh at that today, because today the federal government is very, very powerful in all the branches of government. But in those days, the concern was that we needed to have a strong central government, but we still were very much averse to having a government where there was a strong central figure, like a king or a dictator or somebody like that. So the main powers of the new government were placed in the Congress. The Congress authorized the spending of money. The Congress is authorized in Article 8 of Section 8 of Article 1, what are called the enumerated powers, to set forth all of the different types of things that the government has the authority to do. And that was the first article. The second article deals with the executive branch, with the president. And in many people's minds, the presidency has grown in so much power over the last 200 plus years that it seems that the Congress has been supplanted. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure, as we go forward here today. But that is a major concern that the Congress has today, is that oftentimes executives act on their own, and presidents of both parties. Some may recall President Obama becoming frustrated with the Congress not passing laws. And he said, I've got my pen and my phone, and if you don't do it, I will. Meaning he would, through executive orders and through regulations and other things that could be implemented by the executive branch, he would make changes to the laws in ways Congress didn't intend. That was very, very controversial. But recently we've had quotes from our last president, President Trump, who basically showed a lot of lack of respect for constitutional powers as well. So it's a very, very important role that the Congress plays. And right now, in my opinion, the Congress needs to find ways to assert itself more strongly than it has in recent decades, because they have ceded a lot of powers to the executive branch, and the courts have grown more powerful in terms of their authority to interpret the laws, and have ruled a number of laws passed by the Congress unconstitutional. So the Congress is often struggling to write a new law to replace one that the court struck down and still accomplish the goals that the Congress had in enacting that piece of legislation. So those are all important. You mentioned my role in trying to get the Congress to pay more attention to the Constitution, because if the members of Congress understand the Constitution, they'll understand the powers that they have designated in Article 1 of the Constitution. So back in around 2010, there were a lot of debates about whether Congress was passing laws that were not constitutional and were not paying attention to their powers that they did have. So when the Republicans won the majority back in the 2010 election, I proposed to our leadership that we have a bipartisan reading of the Constitution on the floor of the House as a reminder to everybody where our powers actually come from. And it surprised me and my staff when I asked them, so why don't you check and see the last time that the Constitution had been read on the floor of the House? Because surely over more than 200 years, the Constitution had been read out loud on the floor of the House of Representatives. But it turns out that it had never, ever been read on the floor of the House out loud. So we invited members from both parties to volunteer to come to the floor. It was the day after the swearing in of the Congress and the election of the new speaker. And lo and behold, we got, I can't remember the exact number, but 150 or more members of Congress, it might have been 200, who came down on both sides of the aisle. And the Constitution is not that long, so to divide it up amongst as many as 200 people reading it, we had to give them little paragraphs and even sentences to read, and we did that. For example, we asked Congressman John Lewis, noted civil rights leader, a Democrat from Georgia, to come and read the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which is the amendment that ended slavery. And Congressman Lewis was so proud of doing that he agreed to do it every single other time that we had a reading of the Constitution, I think for 4 more Congresses. And then for reasons that I don't know, the Congress stopped reading it. It was when Nancy Pelosi became Speaker of the House again. For whatever reason, they decided to discontinue this. I think that was unfortunate, but with the new Congress, even though we're in disarray here, we don't have a speaker yet after one ballot having been cast, and I guess they're going to go into a second ballot here soon. The new Congress, the new Republican majority, has decided to reinstate that. And so they will be having a bipartisan reading of the Constitution. I don't know what day it will be, since I think they have to get the speaker elected and the rules adopted first. But it's my understanding that will take place again. Let me stop there. I've talked a little longer than I intended. And why don't we just open it up to questions? Does Tova start that out, or Kathy? How do we begin?
we can go to Tova, and that was fascinating. Thank you so much. I do want, you'd be glad to know that for the past at least 3 years now, we at Constituting America read the Constitution out loud on Constitution Day. And Tova has participated in that, and it usually takes us, we usually only have about maybe 4 people reading it. So it, in some ways, it probably goes a little faster, but you're right about it being fairly short. It doesn't take that long, and it is really powerful when you do read it out loud. It seems like I notice something new in it every time I participate in one of those readings. So it is just such a great experience. But Tova, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And that was a really great overview. It's amazing to hear it from somebody who actually, has been on the front lines of Congress for so long. But so I have a few questions. For one, there's been some talk about like the internal rules that govern Congress, such as like the filibuster or, the way that the speaker is elected. And I was curious what the distinction is between like internal Congress rules versus like powers that Congress has from the Constitution. And so essentially how congressional rules are determined, how easy it is to overturn certain rules, and just kind of an overview of that.
Well, absolutely. So Article 1 provides for the Congress to select a speaker, but it doesn't say how the speaker will be selected. And so as a result of that, rules have to evolve. And originally, one of the sets of rules that came into foremost consideration was Thomas Jefferson's rules of procedure. Now, Jefferson never served in the Congress, but his rules adopted by an early Congress provided the initial way to proceed in the Congress. So these rules are very, very important. As soon as the members of Congress are sworn in by the new speaker. So they all haven't been sworn in, remember. They're all sitting there, they're voting for who's going to be speaker, but it's the new speaker who swears in the rest of the members of Congress. The actual process is that the senior most member who served in previous Congresses, the longest period of time and is still a member, called the president pro tempore, that member swears in the newly elected speaker. But since they haven't elected a speaker who has to get a majority of all the members present and voting, and the majority is very narrow right now, the Republicans have about an 8 or 9 seat majority, meaning that if just 5 Republicans don't vote for the Republican nominee, Kevin McCarthy, who's the Republican nominee, he was nominated in a Republican conference to be the candidate of the Republicans in Congress. And Hakeem Jeffries, a relatively new member of Congress, by the way, from New York City, who I served with on the Judiciary Committee and who I have a great deal of respect for as well. He's like the changing of the guard on the Democratic side. You had 3 people all over 80 years old, Nancy Pelosi being the speaker and Steny Hoyer being the majority leader, and James Clyburn from South Carolina being the majority whip. They all stepped down and they elected a new team. And so the Democrats nominated, if you will, Hakeem Jeffries to be their candidate for speaker. And if he were to win, he'd become speaker and they'd move other people up. But if he doesn't win, he's actually been elected already to be the minority leader of the Congress. And that's selected just within the Democratic caucus, since they have a minority of the membership, and the majority of the membership are Republicans. So they've elected their leadership team, and they're all elected just by their conference too. Only one office is actually provided for in the Constitution and is elected by all of the members of Congress, and that's the Speaker. You have to get a majority of the members present and voting. So if you're not present, or if you don't vote, it doesn't count toward the total you have to get. So you don't necessarily have to get 218, which is a majority of the 435 members of Congress. If several members are not present or for whatever reason choose not to vote, then the threshold is a little bit lower. But in either case, Kevin McCarthy was the Republican candidate, Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic candidate. Neither got a majority on the first ballot. And other candidates received more other votes, not very many, but enough to keep Kevin McCarthy being elected. And some people voted, I think may have voted president. I'm not sure about that. But in any event, they've now got to go on and have yet another vote. And it can go on for a long time. Nobody knows how this will, they could even change the rules of how they're going to elect their speaker if a majority of the members of Congress vote to adopt a rule that says that maybe a plurality is all that's required. Nobody has to get a majority. I think that's a bad idea. But it might come to that if the majority party is not willing to give up their votes to anybody in the other party, which seems very unlikely, but can't get enough votes for any one particular member. And so far, they've only tried one candidate, Kevin McCarthy, but we'll have to see what happens moving forward from there. So it's a very, very tense situation there in the House of Representatives right now. And to answer your question, those rules are adopted at the beginning of each Congress. They're usually worked on by the majority party, and then they're voted on the floor of the House either the same day or the day after the speaker is elected and the members are sworn in. And they can't vote on those rules yet because the members haven't been sworn in. And it's usually a straight party line vote where the majority who wrote the rules all vote for it, and the minority who didn't get to write the rules all vote against it. That's maybe not going to play out this way in this Congress, where you have some Republicans who may not like all of the rules and might decide to vote against some of those too. So it's a very touch and go situation in the Congress right now.
I see. Thank you for that. And then I was wondering, so, since, the Constitution, was created, the population of the United States has increased substantially, but representation in Congress, hasn't increased proportionally to that. I believe it's the same number of seats as, during the Taft administration. It's set now by law. And so, how do you think that, now having more constituents per congressperson affects the way that Congress runs? And, have there been any efforts to increase the number of congresspeople, or, what's your take on that in general?
So there were not any efforts during the time that I was in Congress to increase the number. There have been lots of proposals, but nothing that ever came to even close to getting a vote in the Congress. But they could do that by changing the law and increasing the number. And they did that a number of times during the 19th century and early 20th century, because when we started out, I think there were something like 65 members of Congress. I'm not sure the exact number. And then you're right, they capped it in the 1920s at 435. So I don't know what the population was in the 1920s, but certainly it was well less than half, maybe only a third of the population that we have today. The population we have today is more than 100 times the population we had back when the Constitution was first adopted. So there are reasons to say that you're not getting the same direct relationship with your representative. We are, and people need to remember, people call us a democracy, but we're really a representative democracy where we elect people to represent us, and then they go to Washington. We do this in our state legislatures as well, to adopt the laws representing the people who sent them from their district. But without a restriction, if you kept that same ratio you had when the Constitution was first adopted, there were probably somewhere around 50,000 people for each representative. In fact, let me think. No, maybe only 5,000 people per representative elected. I'm not really clear on those numbers, but if you kept that kind of ratio, you'd have thousands of people serving in the Congress, and it's very, very difficult to get things done in a large legislative body. In the United States House of Representatives, it's the largest legislative body in the United States. No state has more representatives in their Senate or their House than does the United States House of Representatives. So there's been resistance there to increasing it because it becomes very unwieldy. Just think about this. The Judiciary Committee that I chaired had about 40, 41, 42 members. The Virginia State Senate, the entire Senate, not the committees, the entire Senate had only 40 members. And there are lots of other states that have even fewer numbers than that. So you don't want to get it too large, but the larger the population gets, the more people that you represent. And right now, I think the average member of Congress represents about 750,000 people, maybe closer to 800,000 people now. That's a lot of people. And it's very hard for a member to be in touch with 800,000 people to find out what it is they're supposed to be representing them for. So two things about that. One, the most important thing for any representative is to run on their experience and run on where they stand on various issues. And then the people get to vote for them. And then when they get to Washington or another legislative body, they can try to figure out what their constituents want, a majority of them, and vote that way. And many times members of Congress do that. Or they can try to vote their conscience. And by that, I mean their life experience and what they think is right. As between the two, I would give a priority for a member of Congress to vote what they think is the right thing, rather than to try to lick their finger and try to gauge and hold it up to the wind and try to gauge what the sentiment of a majority of their constituents is, for several reasons. First of all, the members are elected to go to Washington and study this legislation carefully and understand the issues. And for the most part, they're going to know more about an issue than their constituents. Secondly, there's no way for the constituents to vote every time. I mean, some people have proposed that you do that on a computer and have some kind of a plebiscite where people can go online and cast a vote and say, this is how I want you to vote on this issue. But they're often doing that without having very much knowledge of how that underlying law that the member is going to have to vote on and maybe offer amendments to would work. So to me, someone who is serious about studying the bills and listening to their constituents and taking that, putting it all together with their own experience and what they think is right, and knowing that in the House of Representatives, they have to run for re-election every 2 years. They can be, if they get that wrong, they can be pulled out by their constituents. I think that's the better way to go. And technology helps in that regard. It's easier for members of Congress to communicate rapidly, and it's easier for their constituents to communicate rapidly with their member of Congress today than it was at any time previously in our country's history. So while the number is much, much larger, the ability to get information out and take information in has improved dramatically as well. And so I don't think you'll see a serious effort to change that number. There might be some more ideal number that I'm not aware of, but 435 has stuck for almost 100 years now, and I suspect it'll stay that way.
Well, thank you so much. And then my final question, just briefly, is about party power in Congress for political parties. Since at the beginning of our country's founding, obviously we had different political parties, and many of the founders were very against, partyism. But now, as you've taken us through, a lot of how Congress functions is governed by political parties. And so can you take us through how this developed? And then as somebody who has worked with a lot of other countries, if you see anything similar in other countries, or if it's a unique system to America?
Sure. Well, that's a good question and not a quick one to answer, but I'll do my best. So first of all, there's absolutely nothing in the United States Constitution about political parties. I don't know how much thought they gave to the fact that people tend to coalesce together to share power. But it was pretty clear right from as soon as they got started that they needed to have a structure, even with only 65 House members and 26 senators when they first got started. They still needed to have rules, and the rules evolved in such a way that people certainly everybody in one political party doesn't agree with everybody else in that political party, but they tend to agree more than they do with people who coalesce in the other party. And that's what happened, I think, sort of naturally with the founding of our country. They evolved into groups. The first group that evolved was the party that was dedicated to saying, we just tried these Articles of Confederation. The federal government needs to have some strength to protect the country, to make sure that commerce grows and that trading across state lines is fair, that we have a president and other, a secretary of state who can represent the country elsewhere. So they wanted more power for the federal government. They're called the Federalists as a result. And then there were people who believed in more direct democracy. So they called themselves Democrats in a time of Democrat Republicans during some of that time as well. And Thomas Jefferson was the leader of the Democrat Republicans, and George Washington didn't really identify himself as being a Federalist, but he certainly acted in a way that would suggest he was a Federalist. And then people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton were Federalists as well. So those parties developed in that fashion. They're really necessary, but they don't have to function the way they absolutely do. But compared to other countries, our system of government is much more decentralized. So the people who elected me to represent them in Congress had a great assurance that if they liked me, they were going to be able to send me back to Congress. If they didn't like me, they were going to be able to replace me with somebody else. In a parliamentary system, oftentimes the party chooses the candidates to run in certain areas. And by that, I mean the national party, not the local party, like happens in the congressional district that I represented here. So I like that aspect of it better, but it does make it harder to pass legislation. If you have a parliamentary system where the prime minister, which is the head of the majority party, say in the United Kingdom, he's also the head of the government. He's not the titular head, that's the king or previously Queen Elizabeth, but they had mainly ceremonial powers. The actual operation of the government is run by the parliament there. So you don't have separation of powers in the same way that you have in the United States. There are some things about the way the Congress functions today, which we might talk about later, that I think would be a good idea. But for now, let me just say that I would probably not want to change over to a parliamentary system of government.
Well, great. Thank you so much for your time. I feel like I learned so much, and now I will happily pass on to Jewel and Jordan.
Hey guys.
Thank you for everything so far. It's obviously a really big topic, and it's an honor to get to talk to someone who knows so much about it because you lived it. There's a big what to our government and our governmental system. And there's an even bigger why to our government and our governmental system. But then there's another element of the how. And the how is not all in the Constitution, as you've mentioned a few times, of the development of how Congress operates. And also that how's pretty hard to understand. So if you could, I have a bunch of questions about how the Congress operates, and we could see how many we can get through before Jordan starts. But his questions, which I think are somewhat similar to mine as well. So first of all, how do the committees function? Have committees been around since the beginning of our government? Who vets, or who gets to know all of the people who are elected in order to be able to place them on committees when there's maybe 200 to 300-ish around for each party, depending on who has the majority and how big the majority is? Could you answer those questions first?
Sure. So those are great questions. I don't believe there's anything in the Constitution about committees, but I think they evolved similarly to the way political parties evolved, and that is it was necessary to not have every member of the House of Representatives handle every issue to get into the minutiae, the fine details of it. So after a while, committees started to form, and it happened fairly quickly. I know, for example, the Judiciary Committee was first formed in 1813. So that was about 20 years after the first Congress met. The reason they evolved was, as I said, to break down the legislation into more manageable subsets. So the Judiciary Committee, as it happens, is one of the busiest committees in the Congress. 1/3 of all the bills in the Congress are referred to the Judiciary Committee in whole or in part, and about 5,000 to 6,000 bills are introduced each year. So the committee is looking at, they're not passing by any means, but they're looking at sometimes between 1,500 and 2,000 different bills that either they have what's called original jurisdiction, meaning the rules of the House say that bill goes to the Judiciary Committee, just like a bill dealing with taxation would go to the Ways and Means Committee, or a bill dealing with an agricultural program would go to the Agriculture Committee. And then they have other bills that are more complex, where more than one committee will get involved with the bill. And in those cases, those bills will be handled by one committee as having primary jurisdiction, but then another as having secondary jurisdiction. So the Judiciary Committee gets all of that. Now, the members of the committee, you asked about that, they are in the Congress selected by the Republican conference for the Republican members and the Democratic caucus for the Democratic members. One's called a caucus, one a conference, but they really function very similarly. And that's different, as I mentioned, than some places where one person, like the Speaker of the Virginia House, picks all the committee members. Those conferences elect a group of their members, since right now there are about 221 or 222 Republicans in the House of Representatives. They don't all meet and talk about every single position. They elect a steering committee, and that steering committee is comprised of about 30 to 40 members, and they meet and they vote first on the chairman of the committees, and then they actually vote to appoint the individual members. And the speaker, go ahead.
How is the steering committee selected?
The steering committee is elected by the full Republican conference, and they divide it up into categories based upon the Republican rules. Now, the Republican rules are different than the House rules apply to the operation of the whole Congress. Republican rules dictate how Republican entities like the Republican conference operate. So for the Republican steering committee,
is Republican directly related to the RNC?
So the Republican National Committee is a Republican arm for anybody who calls themselves a Republican, wants to be involved in Republican politics nationwide, whether it's the Congress, whether it's for president, whether it's for a governor or a senator. I mean, that's a very big organization. There's a smaller organization called the National Republican Congressional Committee, and also the National Republican Senatorial Committee. I think it's what that's called. And they help to get Republicans elected to Congress, but they don't have any role inside the Congress or inside the Republican conference. So the conference sets rules and they do it by region. So if you have a big state with a lot of Republican members like Texas or Florida, they usually get a representative, sometimes maybe even two on that steering committee. The smaller states are combined so that you'll have 3 or 4 or 5 states, and together those representatives from those states will elect one representative to the steering committee. And then the new members of Congress get a representative for them in addition to what they have from their state or states. And there are others like that, but in total it comes to about 35. And then the Speaker of the House, if the Republicans are in the majority, gets 5 votes. And the majority leader, I think, gets 2 votes, whereas everybody else on the steering committee gets 1 vote. So the Speaker has more influence in terms of suggesting which members should be put on the committees and which members should be chairman. And that's why this vote today is a very important vote and very controversial one.
Could you just lay out the duties or the powers of the Speaker of the House? What all is he in charge of, and why is he so important?
So the Speaker of the House controls the floor of the House and he presides in that big chair up above everybody else. Now, if you watch C-SPAN very much, and most people don't, but if you watch very much, you'll see that the actual Speaker of the House, like Nancy Pelosi when she was just Speaker, she's not in that chair most of the time. Overwhelmingly, when there's big votes or a major event, then the Speaker takes the chair. But usually they would appoint a Speaker pro tem, or basically a Speaker for a period of time to preside over the House. They're chosen by the Speaker. The Speaker trusts them, knows that they'll follow the guidance of the parliamentarian who's up there on the dais with the Speaker, telling them what the rules are and how to rule on different things that come up on the floor of the House. So that, combined with the majority leader, they make the critical decisions on what bills come to the floor of the House and what do not. There are very difficult but possible ways around that, but the majority party very carefully controls what legislation comes to the floor of the House. And so the Speaker, being the Speaker, has that control, how the House operates and what the House considers. There are other important things too, but those are the two most important.
That was developed in the House rules, or is that developed in the Constitution?
That's developed in the House rules. It's not in the United States Constitution. And those House rules change every Congress. So every 2 years, you have a new Congress. They have a new set of rules. A lot of the rules are the same. They get carried over and over and over from one Congress to the next. But then there are always a number of new rules. And there are a number of new rules in this new set of rules that the Congress will vote on as soon as they finish picking a Speaker.
We have a lot of audience questions, so we could keep going, or we could get to some of these questions. Kathy, I'm not sure what you'd prefer.
Well, let's go to the audience questions. Those are great questions that y'all had. And some of these topics we'll be covering in future episodes. We're going to have an episode just on the committees, an episode just on the leadership. And so we can get a lot more in at those episodes. But thank you, Jewel and Jordan, and thank you, Tova, for all of your great questions. And before we go to the audience questions, I want to recognize a classroom full of students that we have on with us today. Debbie Otterberg has 30 students from Simley Middle School. And so, Debbie, we want to welcome you and your students for joining us, and just all of our great audience members. Now, Chairman Goodlatte, we have John Holmes asked a question that ties into something we didn't get into too much, that you were a real leader in initiating in the Congress. John asks, is there a vetting process on proposed bills to weed out those which are not constitutional? And if there is such a process, how does it work? And I know there may not be a process to weed out unconstitutional bills, but you started a constitutional justification requirement. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the same year that we started reading the Constitution on the floor, I and a number of other members proposed that when you introduce a bill in the Congress, and I mentioned that in each Congress there are 5,000 or 6,000 bills that get introduced, we said, look, you've got to identify where in the United States Constitution is the authority for the Congress to pass that law. So we required that. And now each time a bill is introduced, there has to be a paper attached to it that sets forth the reason why it's constitutional for the Congress to pass the bill. Now, the fact of the matter is that is for informational purposes only. Nobody sits in a dark room somewhere and goes through all these bills online or whatever and says, that's not constitutional, that's not constitutional, and weeds them out. The Congress, through its normal process, has to do that. And that starts with the parliamentarian sends the bill to a committee, sometimes more than one committee, but to a committee. Let's say it's the Judiciary Committee. The chairman of that committee and his staff, his or her staff, will then have the ability to look at those bills and determine whether they think they're constitutional or not. But they also look at them from a whole host of other standpoints, like, do they think it's good policy? Or do they think it could pass and become law? And that begins a process that weeds out hundreds and hundreds of bills that some of them are very good bills, but don't have the prospect of getting all the way through the Congress, and so may not get much attention. Some of them are not very good bills, and they're blocked there by the chairman of the committee. So committee chairmen are very powerful in that regard, related to the bills that are in their jurisdiction.
Well, thank you. And I think we at Constitute America early on, when you passed the constitutional justification requirement, I think we did a white paper. We had one of our scholars do a white paper on this, on what some of the most often quoted parts of jurisdiction were in the Constitution with these justification statements. I can look for that, and we may drop it in the Q&A here in a few minutes to further elaborate to John for his question. But Rick Mayberry—
That raises a good point. That raises a good point, Kathy, and that is that there's disagreement in the Congress and in the general public, of course, about what is constitutional.
Exactly.
There are provisions in the Constitution, like the General Welfare Clause, which is in the preamble of the Constitution, that some say have been used to justify all kinds of things going into law that probably were never intended to be there in the first place. Then, of course, you have the courts, which can examine these laws and determine whether or not they are constitutional. So there's a long process, but that process has, in my opinion, gotten more and more elastic over time. And we have a federal government that does more and more things today that probably should be considered constitutional. But once they've been put in place and have stayed in place for a long time, it's really hard to roll them back.
Exactly. And that leads a little bit into Rick Mayberry's question. Any ideas how we wrest control from the expanding authority of the president and place it back into the hands of Congress? And that's a theme of several other questions as well.
Yeah,
I know
absolutely.
you were real active in that, actually, when you were in Congress.
So one of the things that we've done to make a start on that, and it's been used quite successfully a number of times now, is called the Congressional Review Act. This is a law that allows the Congress to look at a regulation written by a federal government agency and repeal the regulation. And it only requires a majority vote of the House and the Senate. It does require a signature by the president. If he vetoes it, then you have to have a 2/3 vote to override him. But that's a helpful tool when you think regulations are getting out of control. But it's been used successfully, but it's just one tool and not really strong enough in itself. Another tool to rein in the power of the executive branch is spending. So cutting back on spending by government agencies helps in that regard. But Congress has not, in my opinion, exercised enough strength there. They tend to go along with spending more money and giving these agencies more and more power of the purse, if you will, because not only do they get to spend the money, but they get to decide how it's spent. And a number of years ago, we gave up what are called earmarks. Earmarks they were controversial, and there were some scandals related to them. But the Congress in the Constitution appropriates the funds for all the agencies of the government. But if you then have the government giving money to local governments or other organizations to carry out various things, and you let the agency make that decision, you're getting further and further removed from the power of the Congress, how those decisions on spending money are actually made. Also, the rules of the Senate, in my opinion, need to be changed. It shouldn't be that 40 senators, no matter who's in the majority, should be able to, or 41 senators should be able to block a bill from being passed and sent on to the president. That's not a real democracy. And the Congress, if they can't pass bills, they get them through the hundreds of bills are passed every Congress through the House that lie dormant over in the Senate because they can't get the 60 vote majority to send it to the president's desk for signature. That's unfortunate, in my opinion. It should be changed. Another topic for another day.
Well, thank you. And then Lewis White asks, as the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, can Congress vote to overturn a Supreme Court ruling if it can state the constitutional authority for it?
Well, that's a great question. There are many who have said, this has been a controversy all throughout the history of our country. One of the early Supreme Court justices, I think it was John Marshall, who was one of our most famous Supreme Court Chief Justices, he ruled a matter to be that the Congress had passed unconstitutional. And Andrew Jackson, who was a very strong president of the United States, a Democrat, he said, "Mr. Justice Marshall has made his ruling. Now let him enforce it," meaning we're going to ignore you on that. Now, there's a lot more that goes into that we don't have time to discuss today, but there are many in the Congress who say the court oversteps its bounds in ruling some things unconstitutional. So the Congress and the courts could have a constitutional crisis, if you will, but you have that third, you have a system of checks and balances. You have that third branch, the executive branch. They're generally going to do what the Supreme Court says is constitutional or not constitutional. If they don't, then you're going to have a president of the United States who might face impeachment.
Well, great. Before we run out of time, I want to be sure and highlight these two wonderful organizations that you are putting so much time and leadership and energy into. Aubrey, could you bring up the website for, let's see, this is the Project to Protect the First. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about that? And we have dropped the links into our Q&A.
Sure. This is a nonprofit, bipartisan organization that I'm a senior policy advisor for. There's a Democrat as well, Rick Boucher, who's also a former Virginia congressman. And we work with others, including some former Supreme Court law clerks, to promote and protect the First Amendment: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition your government for redress of grievances. And we work on lawsuits and we work on legislation in the Congress.
Great. And then we also have Project for Privacy and Surveillance Accountability.
I mentioned this a little bit more detail earlier. PPSA is also a nonpartisan nonprofit group that works to help protect citizens' privacy based upon their Fourth Amendment rights. So we work on basically 2 of the 10 amendments to the Constitution that comprise our Bill of Rights. And we think these are 2 of the very most important parts of our Constitution to protect our individual freedoms and to protect ourselves from unlawful, unreasonable government surveillance.
Well, thank you. And we encourage our audience to go on both and check them out and look at all the great resources that are on this website and both websites, and consider supporting them if you feel so led, because you just do great work with them. And we thank you for that. I want to close with a comment from Sharon Tate. She says, not a question, just wanted to say that this was such a timely topic for today as the new Congress tries to elect a new speaker. Look forward to this new series. So thank you, Sharon. And Aubrey, do you want to bring up a fun picture real fast? Look what we found, Congressman Goodlatte, when you received the award in 2015 from Constituting America. There you are receiving our Constitutional Champion Award. And we want to thank you for all your work over the years, for being a guardian of our Constitution and all the ways that you have worked to get the Congress to really consider the Constitution and all that we do, or all that they do. So thank you for that.
It was an honor to receive that award, and I commend you for all the work you've done over all these years to promote a better understanding of our Constitution and the reasons we have to protect it and defend it, as a member of Congress is sworn to do when they are first sworn in. It's to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. And so thank you for the work you do in helping to accomplish that goal.
Well, we are so excited that we're able to have you on to launch this series. And next week, we're going to be talking about the history of the U.S. House with the official historian of the U.S. House. So we invite everyone in our audience to come back for that. And we just wish you a very happy new year and wish our audience a happy new year as well. And Jewel and Jordan, anything y'all want to say to close us out here?
Yeah, it was a great show. And I mean, we could have went for maybe 2 or 3 hours. You answered the questions quickly and effectively and with some serious insider information, which was greatly appreciated on a topic which is really hard to look up or research by yourself.
Yeah,
thank
so
you.
thank you for giving us a great show. I mean, you're definitely a great guest to have on.
So let's do it again sometime.
Okay, thank you. And I think we lost Tova, but I know she says goodbye as well. So thank y'all so much, and we'll see you next week, Tuesday at 2 Eastern.